Ernesto, everybody is familiar with your work on political theory. They know you as a professor from the University of Essex, but many people won't know that everything started in Argentina. Would you like to tell us the story?
Yes, I can tell you something about my background. I studied at the University of Buenos Aires. I graduated at the University of Buenos Aires. During those years, I was first a member of the Argentinian Socialist Party, which split at the beginning of the 1960s into several fractions because it was the moment of the Cuban Revolution and the radicalization of politics in Argentina. And in the end, after a few hesitations, I became part of the leadership of the Socialist Party of the National Left, which was a party with some sympathies with Peronism, but from the point of view of the left. And I was there for 5 years. I was the editor of the weekly of the party, which was called Lucha Obrera, Worker Struggle. And for a set of disagreements, I left the party in the end at the end of the 1960s. And in 69, I came to Britain. I remember that through the mediation of Eric Hobsbawm, I got a scholarship from Oxford to go and do my doctorate there. I was there, then I became a lecturer here, and I stay in England since that time.
Was it the experience from Argentinian politics that prompted you to develop an interest in the theory of hegemony and then to develop this theory even further using the category of discourse?
Yes, it was a mixture of things. Definitely, the political interest about this subject came from my Argentinian experience. For instance, in the 1960s, with the awakening, with the Peronist revival, there was an interest in mass movements in Argentina. At that moment, I read Althusser and Gramsci. From Althusser, I got the notion of overdetermined contradiction, which made me understand that class determination are not the ultimate reference point in political analysis. Yes, that was the first moment of but also the moment of Gramsci, the whole notion about the collective will, the hegemony, all that are new arsenal of categories which came from the Gramscian tradition were very determining at that moment. Then I came to Europe, and there was all the post-structuralist development, Lacanian theory, and Derrida, and the Barthian semiology, and there was a confluence of many elements which helped to organize my viewpoint.
During this first phase, in which you set up the PhD program in ideology and discourse analysis, you develop a whole theoretical framework around the concept of discourse. And this has very important repercussions on the way political identities, social struggles are understood and envisaged. Would you like to elaborate a bit on the way?
I would say that, as you know, I have asserted this several times that I see that the intellectual history of the 20th century arose out of three main traditions. One was phenomenology, the other was analytical philosophy, the third one was structuralism. and each of them center around a basic category, which was at the beginning they had the illusion of an immediate access to things. In phenomenology, this is what happened with the phenomenon. In analytical philosophy, with the referent, and in in structuralism with the sign. And each of these tendencies move in a remarkable, comparable way, because at some point the illusion of immediacy dissolves, and the three of them have to move into one or other form of discourse theory. This is what happened in phenomenology with the existential analytic of Heidegger, is what happened in the second Wittgenstein, the Wittgenstein of the philosophical investigation, and is what happened finally with the post-structuralist critique of the sign.
The implication of all that seems to be that social and political identities are never given, but are always constructed through social and political processes,
exactly.
And in fact hegemonic processes. How does discourse theory conceive of this whole play of construction?
Well, that is a very large issue. Let's say that through different discursive logic that we have tried to present, for instance, the logic of equivalence, the logic of difference, the rhetorical element, which I think is absolutely central in the constitution of identity, and all this creates a situation in which elements are overdetermined in a way which cannot be established a priori. For instance, there are some tendencies today in philosophy which say we have basically the impossibility of unicity. The idea of the one has been shattered. But because of that, we have multiplicity. Now, for me, multiplicity is not a solution to the problem, because multiplicity simply atomizes identities which maintain the same ontological shape as the all one. It's like in Greek philosophy, we are speaking for Greek people here, the one of Parmenides in Democritus become absolutely pulverized into a multitude of, but each one of these units, the atoms, maintain the same characteristic of unicity as the one, as the Parmenidean one.
Psychoanalysis seems to be playing an increasingly important role in your thought. There are references already in hegemony social strategy, but now, for example, in your book on populism, this has become maybe the major theoretical reference. How did this passage take place?
It took place. Well, firstly, it was, as you said, present from the very beginning. The thing is that at the beginning of the 1900s, I was a professor at Buffalo, and there I had my colleague and friend Joan Kopchek, and with her we organized a seminar, a doctoral seminar on rhetoric, psychoanalysis, and politics. And when I was thinking about the theory of hegemony, I was not primarily thinking in Lacanian theory. And I'm perfectly sure that Lacan, when he was writing about the object petit a, he was not thinking in Gramsci. But we started exploring with the logic of hegemony, the way we had developed, and the logic of the object petit a in Lacan, that Jean had studied very much in depth, and we came to the conclusion that it's exactly the same logic, that in one case was discovered from the angle of political theory, in the other case from the angle of psychoanalysis. Because, for instance, the main assertion of Lacan is that we have in sublimation raising a particular object to the dignity of the thing, and the thing is that which is not that is impossible because it's a retrospective illusion, but you project the characters of the thing into a certain particular object. Well, the logic of hegemony, I think, is exactly the same, is that one particular social force or sector at some point become invested with the function of representing the whole. There was in film theory, for instance, this analysis made by Bela Ballas and by Deleuze as well, in which they say that the close-up is not simply that the camera concentrates in a particular object, that object is what becomes to represent the totality. So that our friends now that are focusing their camera on us, they are transforming in us in a symbol of the totality.
During this first phase, in which you set up the PhD program in ideology and discourse analysis, you develop a whole theoretical framework around the concept of discourse. And this has very important repercussions on the way political identities, social struggles are understood and envisaged. Would you like to elaborate a bit on the way?
I would say that, as you know, I have asserted this several times, that I see that the intellectual history of the 20th century arose out of three main traditions. One was phenomenology, the other was analytical philosophy, the third one was structuralism. And each of them center around a basic category, which was at the beginning they had the illusion of an immediate access to things. In phenomenology, this is what happened with the phenomenon. In analytical philosophy, with the referent, and in structuralism with the sign. And each of these tendencies move in a remarkable, comparable way, because at some point the illusion of immediacy dissolves, and the three of them have to move into one or other form of discourse theory. This is what happened in phenomenology with the existential analytic of Heidegger, is what happened in the second Wittgenstein, the Wittgenstein of the philosophical investigation, and is what happened finally with the post-structuralist critique of the sign. Now, I would think that in political theory, in Marxism, which is the tradition in which I was brought up, a similar transition happens. I think the Gramscian moment represents the discursive turn within a tradition which had been very remarkably essentialist before that time. So all these elements have had a confluence in shaping my viewpoint. What is true, although, is that In the 1960s, although this was already present and acting there was a tendency at the time of Levi Strauss and all that to formalize everything in terms of systems of signification. And as you yourself have written, Lacan himself was rather dismissive of affect at that point. The point is that affect was considered as some kind of irrational category added to all these kind of things. So for me, the problem in this connection is how to put the two things together. If they are two things, which finally I don't think they are, because I think affect is simply the stress in some particular signifying element. Affect is not some kind of emotion completely rational. Affect is that some element becomes a source of a particular attachment. On the other hand, signification is possible without affect. I don't think it is. Even for Saussure, the paradigmatic pole of language involve associations which were not governed by any syntactic rule. The most extreme tendency within structuralism, for instance, the Yelmsley and people like them, try to submit even the paradigmatic pole of language to some kind of internal syntax, but they never succeeded. And Saussure himself in the course presents various dimensions in which this thing can go, which are not governed by any internal syntax. Now, he didn't know psychoanalysis, but implicitly everything is there and is the way in which it has to be developed. For instance, in your book, you have pointed out quite rightly about the different ways in which affect, let's say, overdetermine some signifiers and not others. For instance, you say, and I agree with you, that the European Union has never become a real hegemonic signifier because finally the European Union has not been cathected in this proper sense. So what I think is the future for this type of theorization is to see how these two dimensions, signification and overdetermination, which is jouissance finally, imbricate each other. I don't think that theory has been fully developed, and there are elements more formalistic, other elements which go in the opposite direction, but there is where I think we have to start moving.
We are discussing this evening with Chantal Mouffe in London. Chantal, throughout your theoretical trajectory, you have been associated with the emergence of discourse theory, with the return of the concept of the political, with the elaboration of a new approach to politics that you call agonistic pluralism. How did you begin to elaborate this distinct approach?
Well, in fact, after we wrote Hegemony in Socialist Strategy, the book that's co-authored with Ernesto Laclau, where basically, well, one of the arguments was that the problem with Marxism is that because of a certain form of economism, Marxism was not able to grab the specificity of the political. I began to realize that it was not only specific to Marxism, that in fact liberalism was also enabled to grab the political. And that was quite important because at that period, that was in the 80s, there was a general movement away from Marxism and towards liberalism. For instance, it was very clear in France, a lot of left-wing political theorists critical Marxism say, no, the solution is return to liberalism or a move towards liberalism. And I wanted to show that to abandon Marxism because it did not understand the political, to move to liberalism was no solution at all, because we had the same problem of incapacity to grab the political in liberalism. And this is in fact the moment when I became very interested in the work of Carl Schmitt. By the way, I must clarify that contrary to what many people believe, when we wrote Hegemony Strategy, we had not, neither of us had read Schmitt. And in fact, it's a Greek friend, Gregoris Aniadiadis, who just after the publication of Hegemony asked me, have you ever read Carl Schmitt? And he said, no, I have not. He said, well, I think you should read Schmitt because you are going to find many affinities with your thought. So I went, bought the concept of the political, was completely interested, and in fact I've become really hooked with Schmitt since then. So that was in 1985, just after the publication of Hegemony. And of course, I found in Schmitt very important element for the critique of liberalism, obviously, because I think that Schmitt is right when he said that liberalism is absolutely unable to understand the nature of the political. And when liberalism pretend to speak about politics, they either use a vocabulary that borrowed from economics or a vocabulary borrowed from ethics. And in fact, that led me to examine the two main model of democracy which existed at that moment. On one side, the model of aggregative democracy, which was dominant and is still to a certain extent in political science, and the other model that was just beginning to be important, the one that was first elaborated by John Rawls and then developed in a different way by Habermas, the model which is now called deliberative democracy. And in fact, it's quite interesting to see that Schmitt, and he wrote that in the 1920s, already, in a sense, what he said at that time is valid for the situation today, because aggregative democracy is a model that thinks democracy exclusively in a term of economic, and deliberative democracy in terms of ethics. And in fact, this is why I began to try to show that there was no political theory that had anything to say about the political. And the main critique I have to, and that's also something that I share with Schmitt, concerning the model, the two models of democracy which were the present and active in democratic theory, is that they are basically rationalistic. So this is the reason why they can't really accept the fact of antagonism and the ineradicability of antagonism, because of course antagonism refer to a kind of conflict that have no rational solution. If you accept that they are in social life conflict without any rational solution, of course, your whole rationalist framework collapses. And of course, the other question was the critique of individualism. Schmitt said the problem with liberalism is that the individual is terminus a quo, terminus ad quem. You must start from here and arrive there. And of course, if we accept that collective identities are necessarily present in political identities, this again is a reason why liberalism cannot understand the political identities. And of course, here there is another very important question, which I think that is something that I added, because one can't really see that in Schmitt, is that both aggregative Democrats and deliberative Democrats, what they do not understand is the role of what I call passion in politics.
So in your view, this stress of rationality is not capable of accounting for political struggle and also for democracy. How does the agonistic model, what makes it more capable of addressing this constitutive role of the passions?
Yeah, the agonistic model, I began to develop that precisely as an alternative to the two existing model, and I wanted to address the two main questions, which was the lack of understanding of or the rejection, I will say, of antagonism and the role of passion. I think the first point, which is got to the two are related, of course, but it's important to start with the question of antagonism, because if you accept that antagonism is ineradicable, then of course you cannot envisage the aim of democratic politics as being to create a rational consensus, because the very idea of the possibility, the availability of a rational consensus is a thing that collapses completely. So that's why I began to, if you accept that, what then becomes the main task for democracy? And my argument is that accepting that antagonism is ineradicable, that it can, as Smith say, manifest itself in a multiplicity of social relations, then the main task for democracy is try to diffuse this agonistic potential, try to shun, because obviously the agonistic potential, if it's expressed on the basis of the friend and enemy, it's incompatible with the existence of a democratic and the maintenance of a democratic society. You can't have, in a democratic society, the different opponents treating the same friend and enemy. This will, of course, necessarily lead to civil war. This is the reason why Schmitt did not accept the possibility of a viable liberal democracy or a viable pluralist democracy. The recognition of pluralism, of conflict, the legitimation of conflict leads to civil war. So he was saying that the only possible order is an authoritarian order. And of course, this is the reason why on many people, deliberative Democrats, are at pains to eliminate this question of antagonism, because they believe that if they accept the ineradicability of antagonism, they automatically undermine the possibility of democracy and are forced to take the authoritarian route. So for me, that was kind of a challenge, because I absolutely agree with Schmitt on the ineradicability of antagonism. On the other side, I wanted to prove the possibility, the viability of a pluralist democracy. And in fact, this is precisely what the agonistic model is aiming at. How can we imagine a way in which order, a certain form of order, by that I understand, of course, coexistence, social coexistence, is possible within a conception that legitimates conflict. And there the task, and this is what I understand by agonism, is to say, how can one give channel of expression to the conflict, recognizing that there is no absolute, no rational solution, but which is going to make it possible for people to live, you are going to deal with this conflict. And I think that the answer there, or the answer that I'm giving, is that this antagonism can manifest itself under different forms. There is, of course, the antagonism, what I call antagonism proper, which is the friend and enemy, but this conflict can also be played out in a different way, in a way in which there is what I call a symbolic terrain, which is common between the opponents, which is not the case with the friend and enemy relation, because then you really want to destroy the opponent. While you can, under certain circumstances, and of course that depends on the institutions which are available, to give the possibility for this conflict to take place in a way in which it is considered as legitimate. And in that case, we are faced not with a conflict between the friend-enemy type, which is the antagonism proper, but with what I call an agonism. This is a conflict between adversaries. The basic difference here is that adversaries, while they do know that there is no rational solution to their conflict, that one of the side must win, they do accept the legitimacy of the demand of their opponent. So this conflict is played out in a different mode. And this is what I think made possible both the recognition of antagonism, the fact that it is ineradicable, but nevertheless the possibility of a democratic pluralist coexistence. So this is one of the first points that I wanted to show. The other aspect, which is related to the question of passion, is precisely that this agonistic confrontation it is where passion are going to be mobilized in a democratic way, mobilized towards democratic design. But that, of course, requires that there is the possibility for form of collective identification around clearly different projects. And this is why I'm arguing that the blurring of the frontier between left and right, which is something that empirically has happened and we cannot deny it, but my problem is that this is usually seen as a progress for democracy. Democracy has become more mature, and so now we can have a consensus at the center. But of course, the consequences of that is that there is no more those passion cannot be mobilized towards a democratic objective between a conflict between left and right. And I've been interested in showing that this, in fact, is not something which is good for democracy at all. In fact, it's something which is very negative for democracy, because those passion for collective form of identification that move people to act together, they are not going to disappear because they don't have a democratic outlet, but they are going to manifest themselves under the other form of collective identities, about ethnic form of identification, nationalist form, or some kind of organization moral issue. And of course, this is something which is not good for democracy. Or they can manifest themselves in the political terrain, but then in that case it is usually right-wing populist movement who mobilize those passions, because they are very aware that politics is partisan and that it must necessarily be partisan, and that basically what it needs to do is offer different alternatives, that the citizen will really have a choice. And of course, this is basically what all right-wing populism parties are doing. They are saying that they are the only one who offer a choice, who listen to the people, who offer an alternative to neoliberal globalization. Because here, of course, the important element to take into account is that why have we been moving towards this consensus at the center? Why the third way politics and this kind of view in which there is basically no difference between center right and center left parties? Well, of course, this is clearly because the hegemony of neoliberalism has become so really unchallenged that left-wing parties have now accepted that there is no alternative to neoliberal globalization. So one can understand very well why today in many countries the real confrontation is, on one side there is the parties center-right, center-left, seen as establishment parties who say, well, no, sorry, we can't really do anything really more radical, so we'll say the center-left parties, because given the condition of neoliberal globalization, the citizen will not accept to pay more taxes, we can't tax the multinational because they will move somewhere else. So the only thing that we can do is to humanize a little bit more, neoliberalism. That the case of Britain is really an excellent example, because when Tony Blair came to power, it did not challenge at all the neoliberal framework that had been installed by Margaret Thatcher, but simply, wanted to make it a bit more. It's basically, I wrote an article which called Blairism, Thatcherism with a human face, because this is really what it was. So it's not surprising that in circumstances like that, when you have, of course, certain conditions, and for successful right-wing populist parties, you need to have some kind of charismatic leadership. So it does not automatically happen. But when you have that, it's absolutely understandable that those parties can mobilize people and say, we are going to offer an alternative, we are going to listen to you. And I think for me this explained their success in so many European societies. And here I want to insist, for me, basically the people who are responsible for that is left-wing parties. Because left-wing parties should have been those who really listen to the concern of the popular classes. Another problem with center-left parties is that they basically are only representing the middle classes. They've left totally aside the concern of popular sector, the sectors which are, of course, more affected by neoliberal globalization, whose jobs are destroyed or threatened. So there is a real crisis of representation. Those people don't find parties within the kind of traditional democratic spectrum to represent their interests. So they are really attracted by those right-wing populist parties. This is why I believe that what we need, today is to break this kind of consensus at the center for left-wing parties to really present something which is an alternative to the neoliberal one, to distinguish themselves clearly from the center-right parties, and try to develop what we could call some kind of populism of the left. Because what's important is to listen to all those demands and concerns of those groups who are being excluded by the traditional parties. So I think contrary to the general tendency, which is to from a moralistic point of view, and criticize right-wing populist parties. In fact, they will not even call them like that. It's the extreme right. I think this is really a very big mistake, because it's avoiding to try to understand the specificity of those movements. And it's a return of the traditional plague. It's basically like if it was a moral disease, a kind of pathology. Okay, so and then we are going to create some kind of cordon sanitaire, and we are going to shame them and thinking that those are going to disappear. This is the worst possible strategy, no? Because what the left should do is first to make an autocritic, and why, if we abandon those sectors, why are they attracted to those ideas? And then, of course, to try to address those demands and, of course, articulate them in a different way. I mean, they can't give... It's not a question of occupying the terrain, but of addressing those questions and articulating the answer in a different way. This is what the populism of the left should do.